The air changed in that room. The clinking of wine glasses paused mid-toast. Someone gasped. Another laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. But Darius Cole wasn't smiling. He stood up, tall, composed, and simply said, "If this is who I'm doing business with, then I want no part of it. That's it. No yelling, no speeches. Just those words." And then he turned, took his mother by the hand, and walked out of a billion-dollar deal. $500 billion. Gone in less than 30 seconds. But it wasn't about money. Not to him. It was about the woman who raised him. The woman who stood there humiliated, her dignity crumpled on the marble floor of a room full of so-called elites. Her name was Marion Cole. His mother. His world. And someone made the mistake of thinking she didn't belong. That night, the headlines lit up like wildfire. Black CEO walks away from historic deal after racism at private reception. 5B acquisition canceled over racial slur. Aldridge family under fire for incident involving tech mogul. People wanted to know what happened, how a man could rise so high and still be reminded that, to some people, success doesn't erase the color of your skin. But I know what happened, because I was there. And this isn't just a business story. This is about power, pride, and the fire that burns in a son when his mother's humanity is reduced to a joke. Let me take you back to where it all began. Before the scandal, before the press, before the walking out moment that shook Wall Street. Back to the man behind the headlines. Back to Darius Cole, a name they'll never forget, not because of his billions, but because of the day he showed them that integrity isn't negotiable. Now buckle in, because the next 45 minutes, they may just change the way you see power, privilege, and what it truly means to walk away. To understand the weight of that moment, Darius standing in that ballroom defiant, you have to know where he came from. Darius Cole wasn't born with wealth, he was born with resolve. Atlanta, 1987, a single-bedroom apartment, peeling walls, the sound of freight trains just outside the window. That was his cradle. Marion Cole, his mother, worked night shifts as a cleaner at Grayson Memorial Hospital, then straight to a second job at a local diner. Every evening she came home with blistered feet and calloused hands. But she never once complained. Darius didn't have a lot of toys growing up, but he had a computer. One of those old clunky ones someone donated through a church drive. That dusty screen became his world. While other kids played outside, Darius sat at the kitchen table teaching himself code. Line by line, error by error. At 12, he built his first software. At 14, he was tutoring college students in JavaScript. By 19, he'd already launched 2 small platforms. One of them, LoopLink, would eventually disrupt how major corporations handle inter-office communication. That was the seed money. That's how he started Cole Systems. But don't get it twisted. Even as he rose through the ranks of Silicon Valley, they never let him forget. Not the venture capitalists who asked if he was just the face of the company. Not the board member who once mistook him for valet. Not the journalists who said urban background like it was some sort of liability. And yet, he kept going. Because Darius wasn't just building wealth, he was building proof. Proof that brilliance isn't bound by zip code or skin tone. But he didn't do it alone. Marion was always beside him. At every product launch, every investor meeting, always sitting quietly in the back, proud but never needing attention. He called her his North Star. So when the Aldridge family came knocking, proposing a $500 billion acquisition of Cole Systems, Darius was cautious, but curious. The Aldridges were old money, East Coast power brokers, political donors, real estate titans, and for years they had been trying to break into tech. Partnering with Darius would give them instant credibility in the innovation space. And for him, it was supposed to be a legacy move. At least, that's what we thought. The invitation to their estate came handwritten, embossed, as if they were inviting royalty. Private pre-signing reception to celebrate the historic merger, it read. Darius didn't hesitate to RSVP, with Marion as his guest. If she's not welcome in the room, I don't belong there either, he said. We didn't know what was waiting for us inside that marble fortress, but we dressed our best, smiled our brightest, and walked in with our heads high. They called it a celebration. It felt more like a performance. The kind where you're the entertainment, and you just don't know it yet. I wish I could say the estate was warm and welcoming. It wasn't. The Aldridge family lived in a 35,000 square foot colonial mansion just outside Greenwich, Connecticut. Old money at its peak. You could feel the silence of history in its walls, the kind of silence that didn't need to speak to be felt. As we approached the grand entrance, staff in crisp black and white uniforms opened the doors. We stepped onto imported Italian marble. A string quartet played something expensive sounding in the background. But the stairs? They came before we even reached the check-in table. Darius was used to it. He'd mastered that perfect nod. Professional, contained, unreadable. But Marion? She walked with a grace they weren't prepared for. A woman in her early 60s, skin rich and proud, dressed in emerald green satin and pearls, her Sunday best. And that alone was a problem. The first moment came subtle, too subtle for most to notice. A white woman in a floor-length gown handed Marion her empty wine glass. Marion smiled. "I believe you've mistaken me for someone else." The woman didn't apologize. She just blinked, took the glass back, and walked away without a word. Darius saw it. I saw it. But we kept moving. The second moment? Less subtle. In the conservatory, where hors d'oeuvres were being served, a middle-aged man leaned toward Marion and said, "Didn't realize the help was allowed to attend tonight's event." He chuckled, like it was nothing. Marion replied gently, "I'm here as a guest of the man who owns the company you're trying to buy." He turned red, muttered something about a misunderstanding, and disappeared into the crowd. But the room had noticed, and suddenly, the air felt colder. You see, these weren't just slips of the tongue. This wasn't social awkwardness. This was the slow, insidious unpeeling of what they really thought. That money might open doors, but it doesn't erase blackness. And in their world, blackness doesn't belong in that kind of room unless it's pouring the drinks. I watched Marion tighten her grip on her clutch. Her jaw was steady, but her eyes were scanning, looking for Darius, and he was watching it all. Every slight, every whisper, every time a guest walked up to shake his hand, only to pretend not to see the woman beside him. Still, he played the part, shook hands, answered questions about cloud infrastructure and algorithmic ethics, smiled politely when the Aldridge daughters asked if his accent was from the Caribbean or somewhere. He wasn't born with a silver spoon, but they expected him to be grateful to even be invited. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The moment that broke me came near the end of the evening. The lead butler approached Marion, glanced at her invitation badge, and said, "Ma'am, guests aren't allowed past the dining corridor. Staff are asked to remain in the service areas." Marion, calm as ever, handed him the badge and said, "You may want to read that again." He turned pale, but the damage had been done. Marion walked away, silent, proud, but wounded. I followed close behind, and as we turned the corner into the main dining hall, I saw Darius watching her from across the room. He knew exactly what was happening. But the worst was yet to come. There's a kind of silence that feels like thunder waiting to strike. That's what filled the dining room when Marion re-entered. The chandeliers above sparkled like nothing had happened. The servers moved like clockwork, topping off champagne flutes and placing gold-trimmed name cards at each seat. But beneath the orchestral music and clinking glassware, something dark pulsed in the air. Marion didn't say a word. She simply found her assigned seat next to Darius and folded her napkin on her lap. Darius glanced at her, his eyes searching her face for answers. She didn't give him any. Instead, she gave him something stronger: her composure. The head of the Aldridge family, Preston Aldridge Sr., stood at the center of the room. Tall, gray-haired, and smug, he raised his glass to address the crowd. The room fell quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we celebrate legacy, ours and the new one we're about to acquire." A few polite chuckles. Darius stiffened beside Marion. "Now, not every day does a family like mine join hands with a tech visionary from such humble beginnings." He scanned the room like a man hauled in court. "Why, when I was told our new partner's mother would be joining us, I figured, finally, someone here might know how to fold a napkin properly." Laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. One of his grandsons slapped the table, cackling. A senator's wife snorted into her wine. Others shifted awkwardly in their chairs, glancing at Marion, then away. Marion didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just stared straight ahead, as if she'd already buried the words before they hit her. But Darius, his hand clenched into a fist on the white linen tablecloth. His jaw locked, his breathing slowed. I held my breath, waiting, hoping he wouldn't let it slide. And then he stood. No announcement, no warning. He placed his napkin gently on the table, straightened his jacket, and said the words that shattered the room. "I'm terminating the deal." The air cracked like ice. "Excuse me?" Preston laughed, half joking, half panicked. "Sit down, son. It's just a no." "It's not." Darius's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "If this is the culture I'd be tying my name to, if this is how you treat a woman who sacrificed everything for me, then your empire can rot without me." You could hear the wine glass hit the floor 3 tables down. No one moved. No one said a word. Marion reached for her son's hand. He took it without breaking eye contact with Preston. "You think I need your money?" he asked. "You think that $5 billion gives you the right to speak to her that way? You have no idea what she's worth. And clearly, you have no idea what I'm worth either." With that, he turned. Marion rose beside him, her expression, quiet pride. The two of them walked out, through the stunned silence, past the glimmering chandeliers, over floors not meant for their feet. And when the doors closed behind them, the entire room exhaled like they'd been holding their breath since he spoke. Too late, the damage had already been done. They didn't speak as they walked out. Not a word, not a glance back. Just the echo of Darius's shoes across the marble floors and the soft shuffle of Marion's heels beside him. Outside, the air felt colder, freer. A valet rushed to bring their car around, fumbling with his radio as if trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed. Darius opened the door for his mother. She paused. "You didn't have to do that," Marion said softly, voice calm but cracked. "You didn't have to lose everything. For me." Darius looked her straight in the eyes. "I didn't lose anything that mattered." And that was the truth. But the world didn't see it that way. The next morning, the story was everywhere. CEO walks away from historic $5 merger after mother targeted at gala. Billionaire family accused of racist remarks sparks corporate fallout. Darius Cole stuns tech world with bold exit. Talk shows debated whether it was heroic or emotional. Financial blogs called it the biggest self-sabotage in startup history. Wall Street gasped, but Black Twitter roared with pride. Marion, meanwhile, stayed silent. Not a single interview. Not even a statement. She cooked breakfast that morning like she always did, as if her name hadn't just been weaponized in headlines. But Darius, he knew what he'd done. He'd sent a message, one that money couldn't distort. Still, the fallout came hard. Within 48 hours, Cole Systems' valuation dropped by $112 million. Potential partners began postponing meetings. Reporters camped outside his home. A few board members called emergency meetings, demanding to know what he was thinking. One of them even had the audacity to ask, "Couldn't you have just issued a statement instead of making a scene?" A scene? Marion's dignity was not a scene. A room full of billionaires laughing at a black mother's presence. That was the scene. And they had front row seats. Still, pressure mounted. Investors wanted answers, stockholders wanted reassurance, and some of Darius's most loyal executives started quietly dusting off their resumes. But Marion? She remained unshaken. One evening, Darius sat beside her on the porch of her modest Atlanta home, the same one she'd refused to leave even after her son became a millionaire. "Maybe I was wrong," he whispered. She placed her hand over his. "Right doesn't always come with applause, baby. Sometimes it just comes with peace." And she was right, because for the first time in weeks, Darius slept that night. But the Aldridge family? They were far from finished. Behind closed doors, whispers turned to meetings. Lawyers were summoned. Media consultants drafted carefully worded statements. And somewhere in a penthouse office, someone decided that if they couldn't buy Darius Cole, they'd try to bury him. And just like that, the real battle began. Darius Cole had made his stand, publicly, boldly, and with conviction. But the thing about walking away from power? Power doesn't always let you walk away clean. Within a week, the backlash began. First, it was subtle. An opinion column in the Daily Street titled, "Emotions and Executives, Did Darius Cole Overreact?" written by a so-called analyst who had never met the man. Then, a podcast episode hosted by a former tech investor casually questioning Darius's emotional intelligence and calling the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the worst came 3 days later. A leak. An internal email chain from Aldridge Holdings mysteriously surfaced, intentionally no doubt. It detailed reputational mitigation strategies and included phrases like, dismantle the Cole mystique, target his credibility through professional networks, influence investor sentiment subtly but swiftly. Translation: character assassination in suits and silence. The same circles that once toasted him began closing ranks. VC firms who'd once courted him with champagne and promises of changing the face of tech stopped returning his calls. Several clients terminated contracts effective immediately. PR firms whispered about his instability. And just like that, Darius became radioactive in boardrooms where he used to shine. Let's be honest. If he were white, if his mother looked like theirs, that room would have erupted in outrage the moment Preston Aldridge opened his mouth. But instead, they circled the wagons, around the offender, not the offended. But Darius didn't back down. He released a single statement. I walked away to preserve something more valuable than capital, my integrity. If that costs me favor, I'll consider it a discount. Some clapped, others cringed. And the Aldridge family? They doubled down. Their media machine rolled out a full-blown damage control campaign. One article painted Marion as overly sensitive to an innocent joke. Another claimed Darius had a track record of impulsive decisions, citing a single boardroom disagreement from years earlier. And the worst? A former employee, paid off no doubt, publicly alleged Darius created a culture of fear at Cole Systems. The claim was baseless, but truth isn't the goal in these situations. Doubt is. Marion stayed home during all of it. The woman who'd scrubbed floors, folded linen at 3 a.m., and held her son's head when he had the flu at 6 years old, was now being dragged by strangers who didn't know the first thing about dignity. And Darius, he was furious, but he wasn't reckless. He called a meeting with his remaining board members and laid everything bare. They want us to fold. I won't, but I'm not going to war without a strategy. I need fighters, not fence-sitters. Half the room stood with him. The other half, they were already packing their bags. That was the turning point. Not the night of the joke, not the media circus, but that boardroom. When Darius realized that survival wouldn't be granted, it had to be earned. Again. And this time, the battle wasn't for a seat at the table. It was for his name, his legacy, his mother's honor, and the soul of everything he'd built. They thought they could silence him. They thought if they froze him out of deals, smeared his name, and pressured his partners, he'd back down, that he'd crawl back, apologize, and beg for re-entry into their world. But Darius Cole wasn't bred for submission. He was built for resistance. When they came after his reputation, he didn't hide. He pulled out the receipts, emails, recordings, private correspondence that exposed just how deep the Aldridge family's tactics went. He didn't leak them to the press. He went somewhere stronger. He went to the people. It started with one live-streamed video. No media filter. No talking heads. Just Darius, sitting in his office facing the camera. I was never supposed to be in those rooms, and they never let me forget it. Not when I raised $100 million. Not when we turned our first profit. And certainly not when I brought my mother to a dinner where they mistook her presence as servitude. He paused. Calm, precise. They don't want me to speak. So now I will. The video went viral in 3 hours. 12 million views in 24. Not just reposted, but felt. People weren't sharing a scandal. They were sharing a mirror, one that reflected the ugly reality too many had experienced, but never seen validated at that level. And that was only the beginning. Darius launched a campaign called Belong Anyway, an initiative focused on highlighting Black professionals who'd faced discrimination at the highest levels of business. CEOs, doctors, engineers, Ivy League professors, people who'd once been asked, "Do you work here?" in places they built. Stories poured in by the thousands. He hosted panels, college speaking tours, corporate accountability workshops. He even walked into the Lion's Den, an open forum at a major investment summit, where he publicly challenged the Aldridge Group's influence. They didn't respond, not directly. But behind the scenes, the pressure shifted. Companies that had distanced themselves from Darius began reaching out again. Not with apologies, but with silence. The kind that comes when people realize they picked the wrong side of history. And Marion, she watched it all unfold with the same calm strength she raised him with. One night, after Darius finished a late interview, she said to him, "You know, baby, this was never about that dinner. It was about them thinking I was invisible, and you reminding them that I'm not." Those words hit different. Because for so many women like Marion, mothers, grandmothers, caretakers, humiliation has long been something endured in silence. But this time, her son made the whole world listen. And it wasn't just about a dinner party anymore. It was about dignity. It was about the cost of belonging. And Darius? He was no longer interested in begging for a seat at their table. He was building his own, one where his mother would never be mistaken for the help again. By the time the dust began to settle, Darius Cole had lost millions. But what he hadn't lost was his purpose. The Aldridge family had underestimated the resilience of a man raised by a woman who survived decades of being overlooked, underestimated, and disrespected, yet never let bitterness take root. They had tried to fracture his empire. And yes, cracks appeared. But what they didn't realize was that Darius had stopped building for them a long time ago. He was building something else. Something freer. Something rooted. Darius restructured Cole's systems from the ground up. Gone were the silent partners who flinched at controversy. In their place came a new breed of backers, investors from historically black colleges, indigenous-led funds, and tech alliances tired of playing by rules designed to exclude them. He created a new fund called the Legacy Initiative, focused entirely on funding startups led by women and people of color. Not just for charity, for profit. Serious profit. Because for Darius, justice wasn't just about speaking out, it was about redistributing access. And then he went further. He converted 20% of his own equity into employee shares, rewarding loyalty over silence. While others saw a man recovering from public ruin, we saw a man turning ashes into architecture. But make no mistake, it wasn't easy. Behind the headlines, Darius was battling sleepless nights, legal threats, and corporate espionage. At least 3 major deals fell through at the last minute. Too much risk, they said. Yet he kept building, because now it wasn't just about revenge, it was about his mother. One night, I sat with Marion on her porch, and she looked me straight in the eyes. "He's becoming who I prayed he would be," she said softly. "Not just rich, but righteous." Meanwhile, the Aldridge family was fighting their own war, one of silence and spin, but cracks were forming. A tech reporter unearthed internal documents linking the family's PR firm to fake social media accounts spreading disinformation about Darius. A whistleblower confirmed that certain executives had deliberately interfered with Darius's client relationships. The public didn't just recoil, they revolted. Protests started popping up outside Aldridge-owned properties. Clients began quietly pulling out. Major political donors cut ties, and then came the tipping point. Darius appeared on 60 Minutes, not to cry, not to rage, but to reason. "I'm not angry," he said, "I'm just done being quiet." He didn't smear names, he didn't name-call. He told the truth, plainly and painfully. And America listened. Even those who had once dismissed him began to reconsider what they thought they knew about who gets to lead and why. Darius was no longer just a CEO. He had become a movement, not because he sought revenge, but because he demanded restoration. And while the Aldridges tried to cover their empire in silence, Darius was out here, making noise that sounded a lot like justice. The Aldridge family was used to winning. They were used to controlling the narrative, owning the room, and erasing problems with money and silence. But this time, they picked the wrong man to humiliate, and the wrong mother to underestimate. Because when Darius Cole stood up and walked away, it wasn't just a protest, it was a spark. And sparks, they spread. 1 month after Darius's 60 Minutes interview, the dominoes began to fall. It started with a leaked deposition from a former Aldridge Holdings executive, sworn testimony that confirmed the family's active attempts to sabotage Darius's reputation, along with proof they had threatened one of his key vendors into backing out of a multi-million-dollar contract. The deposition went public, and suddenly, the media that had once played neutral now sharpened their knives. Headlines flipped. Darius Cole vindicated. Internal sabotage confirmed. Whistleblower details racist culture inside Aldridge Holdings. From powerhouse to public pariah. Then came the sponsors. Within 2 weeks, 3 major corporate sponsors pulled out of Aldridge's annual finance summit. Universities that once courted their endowments began freezing collaborations. A government watchdog launched a quiet ethics probe into their political donation channels. But the biggest blow? One of the Aldridge family's flagship development projects in Chicago, valued at over $400 million, was suspended indefinitely after community organizers, emboldened by Darius's story, exposed years of discriminatory hiring practices and land disputes. They had always assumed they were untouchable, but racism has a funny way of aging poorly in the light of truth. Internally, fractures widened. Preston Aldridge Jr., who was being groomed to take over the family empire, resigned from his executive position under health reasons. Rumors swirled that he had begged the family to publicly apologize to Darius. They refused. Instead, they doubled down, holding private galas and issuing vague press statements about regret and misunderstandings. But by then, it was too late. No spin could fix what the world had already seen. The final nail came from within. A former Aldridge family attorney released a confidential memo, written just days after the infamous dinner, that detailed a crisis strategy labeled "Neutralize Cole." The memo outlined how to reframe the narrative, exploit emotional language, and cast doubt on his stability. It backfired spectacularly. Social media exploded. Protesters gathered outside Aldridge headquarters in New York with signs that read, "I am Marion Cole," and "Neutralize racism, not truth." And Darius? He never gloated. He never fired back. He kept building, quietly, steadily. While they clung to their shrinking thrones, he was creating corridors of opportunity for those who'd never been allowed through the door. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is relevance. And Darius Cole, he wasn't just relevant. He was the future they could no longer afford to ignore. Their empire cracked. Not because he attacked it, but because they exposed themselves when they thought no one would ever dare to stand up. But he did. For himself, for his mother, for every room that tried to decide who deserved to be seen. 1 year later, the house looked different. It wasn't a mansion in Connecticut. It was a new community tech center in Southwest Atlanta. Nothing about it screamed wealth, but everything about it whispered legacy. Outside the building stood a bronze plaque etched with 6 simple words, "The Marion Cole Innovation Academy." Underneath it, in smaller letters, "Built on dignity, not permission." Darius didn't want a ribbon-cutting ceremony. He wanted a dedication, and not for himself, for her. Marion stood at the center of it all, dressed in a deep burgundy suit, the same quiet grace on her face that once withstood a room full of judgment. But this time, the room applauded her. The mayor spoke. Former students gave testimonies. A 15-year-old black girl, her voice trembling, said, "I didn't think tech was for people like me, but now I know it is." Darius stood to the side, his eyes never leaving his mother. He had done it. He'd kept his promise. Not just to walk away from what disrespected her, but to walk towards something that honored her. The Aldridges? Their name still exists. Their buildings still stand. But their silence? It cost them everything. Because while Darius was being written off in boardrooms, he was being written into something far more permanent, the hearts of people tired of asking to belong. And here's the truth. He didn't walk away from a $5 billion deal. He walked into his real value. He proved that power doesn't come from proximity to the wealthy. It comes from remembering who you are when they try to make you forget. I asked Marion once how she stayed so calm through it all. She smiled gently, looked me in the eye, and said, "Because I've known who I was since before they decided who I wasn't." That stayed with me. And if you're watching this, I hope it stays with you too. Because this story, it's not just about Darius and Marion. It's about you. It's about the moment someone tries to define your worth by where you came from, and you remind them of where you're going. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away, not in weakness, but in wisdom. It's about the quiet revolution of Black excellence that doesn't ask for validation. It builds, it stands, it remembers, and it refuses to be erased. So here's my question to you. What would you do if the world laughed at your mother? Would you fold to keep your seat at the table? Or would you flip the whole table over and build your own? If this story moved you, if you felt Marion's strength, if you admired Darius's courage, then join us. Subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Here we tell the stories others try to bury, and trust me, we're just getting started. Every week, we drop real stories, Raw stories, uncomfortable truths, stories that speak louder than silence. So don't just scroll past. Hit that button. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who still believes dignity costs too much. Because sometimes, walking away from the wrong deal is the best deal you'll ever make.